She was just a passenger until the engines failed and the pilots watched her seize control. I wasn't supposed to be on that flight. Aisha Johnson's voice trembled in my headphones as the camera zoomed in on her dark eyes haunted by memories. Moments ago, she'd been a quiet passenger on Flight 512 from Los Angeles to Chicago, clutching a crossword puzzle book and a yellowed scrap of paper her mother had scribbled before she left home. Trust yourself always. Now, somewhere above the Arizona desert, everything was about to change. Aisha sat in seat 14C, buried beneath a sea of earbuds, half-empty coffee cups, and flickering cabin lights. The engines hummed steadily, at first too steadily, while the late afternoon sun glinted off her green sweater, the same one she wore on the day she resigned from the Navy for speaking up about safety violations. That decision had cost her career, but it had never silenced her conviction: if something's broken, you fix it. She flipped the page of her crossword puzzle until she noticed something that didn't fit the engine tone had shifted a subtle warble only an engineer would hear. Her heart tightened. Passengers drifted in and out of phone calls, eyeing the red signal on the overhead panel. No one else seemed to notice the flicker, just a momentary dip in electrical power. Aisha's jaw clenched. Years of running diagnostics on military jets had taught her to treat every anomaly like a warning. Overhead, the mask panels rattled as though testing gravity. She let her fingers trail over her puzzle book, where the final 7-letter answer remained blank. Without thinking, she wrote "Kando" in sharp pencil across the bottom line. It felt like a talisman, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Then came the jolt. The plane dropped hard, as if dragged by an unseen force, and the cabin lights died altogether. 2 seconds of pitch darkness swallowed every breath. Then emergency lights. Then the hiss of oxygen masks dropping in unison. Screams rose in a wave. Cold fear flooded Aisha's chest. The engines went silent, replaced by a whining whisper of aerodynamics gone wrong. Her training kicked in before her panic. Did systems error, hydraulics offline, rudder unresponsive? She heard it through the crackling radio, muffled by static and terror. She scribbled red-hot notes on her notepad: 12 minutes of flight time, left altitude, bleeding options running dry. Nobody on the plane knew she once wrote the Navy's cascade failure protocols. Nobody knew she taught aerospace students in Tucson how to stay alive when all systems collapsed. She wasn't the passenger in seat 14C anymore. She was the only hope this jet had left. But stepping out of her seat meant stepping into chaos. The flight attendant's voice cracked, begging calm. Aisha let the moment stretch, weighing risk and responsibility. In the back of her mind, her mother's words echoed, "Trust yourself always." She closed her eyes, gripped her notepad, and stood up, ready to change the course of fate. And then the cockpit door buzzed, but not with permission. "I'm not waiting for permission," Aisha whispered, as the cockpit door finally clicked open. The tension in the cabin was electric. Every heartbeat felt like thunder, and she barely registered the flight attendant's relieved nod before she slipped inside. The stale scent of recycled air and overheated circuitry hit her first screens, flickering warning lights strobing in dull orange. Captain Reed looked up, eyes wide and hollow, like a sailor lost at sea without a compass. Next to him, First Officer Kim's hands trembled over a tangle of switches. Both wore the same look, defeated. Aisha's pulse hammered, but her voice stayed steady. "Show me your circuit load on the secondary bus." She crouched beside the panel, the green of her sweater flashing hope in the dim light. Marcus Hayes's face flickered through her memory, smiling at shareholders bragging about cost cuts. That smile was everywhere responsible for this. She traced the frayed wiring with gloved fingers, then flipped a switch labeled Bleed Air Override. Sparks spat as the backup generator coughed to life. A low hum returned, almost musical. "Rudder check," she said, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold. Reed pressed his foot against the pedal. A faint shudder ran through the tail, the plane straightened by a fraction of a degree. "Good," Aisha said, standing so quickly she bumped her head on an overhead conduit. "But we're not out of danger." She grabbed the folded map marked Sakaton Field and unfurled it against the console. No runway lights, no radar beacon, just an old strip scrawled on paper. Crosswinds kicking at 30 knots. We need a long, shallow arc to drift in from the west. Any sharper, and we'll snap this fuselage like a twig. Reed's face flickered between relief and fear. Doable, he asked, only because we have no other choice. She tapped the final letters of her crossword talisman Kando, etched across her notepad. That scribble felt heavier now, a mantra born of desperate courage. A man in 14A had called her crazy minutes ago. If he were here, he'd see how reality bends when you refuse to stay silent. Outside the cockpit window, the desert sun had dipped behind distant mesas, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds, a symbol of final warnings. Down the aisle, the cabin had fallen into a hush, broken only by muffled sobs and soft prayers. A mother held her son tight, whispering verses in Spanish. A teenage girl draped her phone over the seatback, live-streaming the flickering emergency lights, Schwarzer Flight 512, Schwarzer for Pry Forest. An older black man in the front row gripped his cross-necklace eyes, glistening with a blend of faith and dread. This plane had become a cross-section of hope's fears and unspoken truths. Aisha keyed the cockpit microphone. Passengers, this is your captain. We have limited control but are aiming for Sakaton Field. Keep your masks on and your seatbelts fastened. Her voice cracked just on the last word, but she held it together. Then she turned back to Reed and Kim. Fuel vapors building in the left wing. Tilt us right on touchdown. We go belly first, no landing gear. Her words tumbled out in a rush of technical jargon, but they were laced with raw humanity, the risk of fire, the promise of survival. Reed swallowed hard and nodded. Kim adjusted the throttle and trim. The final seconds stretched like eternity. Aisha braced herself against the console, fingers tightening on her notepad, a lifeline inked in graphite. The desert below grew larger, jagged ridges blurring. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, whispering the words her mother wrote, "Trust yourself." Then she opened them again, ready to guide this metal bird down into a storm of sand and steel. The first gust of wind rattled the cabin, and everything went quiet right before the descent began. Brace for impact, Aisha's voice cracked over the speaker. Though the tremor was hers alone, every soul aboard Flight 512 strained to hear her calm confidence. The desert below had rushed up in a blur of russet and gold. Sakaton Field was no longer a dot on her map, but a ragged strip of earth mere seconds from their hull. The cockpit rattled as she braced her hands against the console. The etched letters Kando on her notepad burned into her mind like a lifeline. The engines were gone. The landing gear stuck. Belly landing was their only option. In her head, she replayed every simulation she'd taught, from the Navy hangars in Pensacola to late nights grading aerospace theses at the University of Arizona. Yet nothing matched the raw terror of hundreds of lives depending on her next instruction. Captain Reed's knuckles whitened as he fought the yoke. First Officer Kim toggled trim switches under Aisha's direction. Across the aisle, a mother tightened the straps on her son's mask, tears tracing silent rivers down his cheeks. Aisha's heart ached. She inhaled the stale cockpit air, tasting resolve. 30 feet. 20. Hold your line, she murmured, eyes locked on the horizon. The wind howled through a panel breach, rattling their makeshift command center. She pictured her mother's wrinkled hand folding that scrap of paper, the words scrawled in looping script, "Trust yourself always," a symbol of fierce love that had carried her through court-martials, prejudice as a woman of color, calling out safety violations, and now this final descent. The plane shuddered as the fuselage scraped earth. Sparks flew like shooting stars in reverse. Passengers howled, but Aisha's voice rose above the chaos. Stay seated, brace for slide. Time fractured. Every second stretched into an eternity of screaming metal and shifting weight. A flash of green from her sweater caught the emergency lights, hope incarnate, in wool and determination. The cabin pitched sideways, then righted itself. Dirt and gravel showered in, punctuating the end of their flight and the beginning of something no one could erase. Aisha pressed her back to the bulkhead. Mind-racing fuel vapor still hissed from the left wing. If they didn't roll clear, ignition could claim them all. She leaned forward, her fingertips brushing the co-pilot's shoulder. "Angle us left when we stop, then run." The slide slowed. The aircraft groaned, then stilled. Silence crashed in a stark contrast to the roar moments before. Then a single click, the emergency slide deployed. Aisha's chest heaved as she unbuckled, scanning the cabin through a haze of dust. Faces stared back, fear, relief, an unspoken debt. She climbed out, boots crunching over rocks, and helped the elderly woman from the aisle, guiding her down the slide. Each step carried the weight of their survival. Behind her, a teenage girl raised a shaky phone, tears streaming as she whispered a prayer of thanks in a language that wasn't her own. A siren wailed in the distance. Rescue was on its way. Yet the true victory was the hush that fell over Flight 512's survivors, a collective breath held between life and death. Aisha paused at the base of the slide, knelt and pressed a hand over her heart. The desert wind tugged at her hair as she gazed at the twisted fuselage, a monument to courage born from silence. Then, without a word, she rose, ready to face whatever came next. Every story needs its heroes, but sometimes the real hero hides in plain sight. The on-scene reporter's voice crackled through the handheld camera's mic as emergency crews swarmed around the battered fuselage of Flight 512. Aisha Johnson stood at the perimeter, her green sweater now streaked with dust and tears, arms wrapped around herself like armor. The desert wind tugged at her hair, carrying the scent of overheated metal and adrenaline. Behind her, passengers filed past, some clutching blankets, others wiping tears, all of them alive because one woman refused to stay silent. A hot gust kicked up grit that caught in Aisha's eyelashes, and for a moment she imagined those tiny particles were the broken promises of a system that valued profit over safety, dust settling on a legacy of neglect. She watched a family reunite, a mother collapsing into her husband's arms, a little boy hoisting himself onto the firefighter's shoulders. Their relief was raw, unfiltered, a mirror of her own. Yet as the cameras turned toward the cockpit steps, sniffing for a face to plaster on the evening news, Aisha felt herself recede. She wasn't looking for glory. She'd stepped into that cockpit to fix a machine, not to collect applause. Still, the world needed a story, and in their rush to name a hero, they'd overlook the silent sacrifices, the midnight simulations, the lost promotions, the whispered warnings she'd shouted down corridors no one wanted to hear. A nondescript crossword puzzle book peeked out of her backpack. The final word, Kando, scrawled in, led a testament to the power of belief over permission. By dusk, news outlets spun their headlines: passenger pilot professor saves plane, mystery engineer. Social media exploded with clips of Aisha's calm commands, looping the moment she flipped that bleed air switch and restored rudder control. Comments ranged from awe to skepticism. Some praised her courage, others questioned her right to intervene. Somewhere in the digital ether, someone brought up her race and gender, sparking debates about who gets to speak up in moments of crisis and who gets silenced by bias. Aisha scrolled through the feed, heart pounding, as she waded through a river of admiration and microaggressions. Her eyes flicked to the yellowed scrap of paper in her hand, her mother's reminder to trust herself, and she crumpled it gently, as if acknowledging that every victory carried its own scars. Night fell. The runway lights dimmed, save for a single spotlight trained on the ruined plane. Aisha slipped through the chain-link fence, leaving the chaos of loudspeakers behind. Each step felt surreal, the ground firm under her boots, but her mind adrift in memories the moment the cockpit door buzzed open, the spark of metal on metal, the trembling preacher, in row 13. In the hush of the desert night, she heard a distant siren somewhere. Someone was still fighting. She paused, chest heaving, and looked back at the silhouette of Flight 512 against the twilight sky. This wasn't an ending. It was a crossroads. Across the horizon, the first lights of Phoenix glimmered, promising a return to routine she no longer belonged to. Aisha inhaled, tasting both the freedom and the burden of a story unfinished, and whispered to the wind. "Now the real work begins. You saved us, but you're still just a passenger." The local news anchor barked into the camera as Aisha Johnson stood off-screen, clutching her green sweater tighter. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a warning bell. Moments ago she had watched the burned-out carcass of Flight 512 disappear from view, and now reporters circled her like vultures hungry for a soundbite. She swallowed, remembering the final letters she'd scrawled across her crossword talisman Kando, and how that simple promise had carried her through chaos. "I'm no hero," she finally said, voice low but steady, surprising even herself. "I just did what had to be done." Flashbulbs popped as she turned away, squeezing past cameramen into the terminal. The chatter of cell phones and adrenaline hung in the air. Strangers patted her on the back, eyes shining with gratitude and relief. But beneath each smile, Aisha felt the weight of every life she'd held in her hands. She wondered how many would debate her right to intervene. How many would question a woman of color stepping into a cockpit? In her mind, Marcus Hayes' smirk flickered, that corporate grin hiding the cost-cutting blunders he'd ordered in Phoenix. Profit over people had nearly killed them all. At baggage claim, her crossword book tumbled from her carry-on. She bent to retrieve it, catching sight of the puzzle's final word, Kando, pressed into the thin paper. That word had been her lighthouse when all else went dark. A little boy tugged at her sleeve, eyes wide. "Thank you," he whispered, holding out a crayon drawing of a plane with wings of light. She knelt, accepting the gift, her own eyes stinging. In that moment, she understood her story meant something beyond statistics and headlines. It was proof that courage needn't be loud to be powerful. Outside, the desert sun had given way to a violet twilight. Aisha hailed a cab and sank into the back seat, the engine's hum oddly soothing. She stared out at endless blacktop, the Phoenix skyline glimmering like distant stars. For the first time since boarding Flight 512, she let herself feel the exhaustion in her bones, the adrenaline crash that follows every triumph. She pressed a hand to her chest, tracing the scar under her collarbone where her Navy uniform once pressed a reminder of battles fought in silence. Hours later, her phone buzzed an email from FAA investigators requesting her testimony, another from a local congresswoman praising her extraordinary bravery, and at the very bottom, a single line from Marcus Hayes. "We need to talk about what really happened in the cockpit." A surge of anger and fear tangled in her stomach. He wanted to control the narrative, to spin the story his way. But she wasn't the silent engineer anymore. She tapped open a blank reply, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Words formed in her mind: truth, accountability, change. She paused, lifted her gaze to the rearview mirror, and saw the reflection of a woman poised between worlds, the quiet professor who taught students to solve equations, and the unexpected savior who reshaped a whole industry's ethics. Outside, the cab sped toward a city that would never forget Flight 512, but Aisha Johnson knew the real journey was only beginning. The night was heavy with possibility, and as she set her fingers to the keyboard, she whispered to herself and to the millions who might read, "It's time we fix more than machines. You owe us the full story." Marcus Hayes' email blinked on my screen in all caps, the subject line. Clarification required, feeling more like a threat than a request. I stared at it in the dim glow of my kitchen light, the words echoing my own heartbeat. I owe the world the truth. Earlier that morning, I'd drafted a calm reply, offering a sanitized version of events to spare the airline bad press, but every fiber of my being rebelled. My mother's scrap of paper lay next to my laptop. "Trust yourself always." The jagged pencil letters felt heavier tonight, a symbol that courage demanded honesty, not convenience. I deleted the email draft and opened a second window, the FAA hearing notice. The date was set 2 weeks away in Washington, D.C., where I would stand before regulators, lawyers, and executives, Marcus's allies among them, and lay bare every risk we'd taken and every shortcut he'd ordered. My green sweater hung on a chair nearby, now worn and frayed at the cuffs, the same one I wore when I first refused to look the other way in the Navy. Putting it on felt like donning armor again. I took a deep breath, punched in my password, and typed, "Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to providing a full account of the system's failure and corrective actions taken." The truth was, a risk testify, and I'd face corporate lawyers trained to twist words, question my credentials as a woman of color, and bury evidence of their negligence. Yet, if I stayed silent more, lives could be endangered next time corners were cut. I pictured the cabin of Flight 512 masks dropping in unison, the hush before impact, the crucible of adrenaline that forged my decision. I remembered how the teenage boy in row 16 had called me crazy, only to later say, "Thank you for not staying quiet." Their lives had become my burden and my purpose. The next days blurred into preparation, poring over maintenance logs that revealed Marcus's cost-cutting memo, cross-referencing flight recorder transcripts, and rehearsing my testimony in the mirror. Each night, I fell asleep clutching that crossword puzzle book, the final entry Kando scribbled defiantly across the bottom. It wasn't just a word, it was a battle cry against apathy and profit-driven recklessness. On the morning of the hearing, I walked into the sterile conference room where FAA officials and legal teams convened. The judge's gavel thundered, demanding order. Marcus sat at the table opposite me, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. He opened a manila folder, the pages rustling like whispers of buried evidence. I straightened in my chair, the green sweater, a beacon of quiet strength, and laid my notepad on the table, the Kando visible through the visor. I began, "My name is Aisha Johnson. On October 12th, Flight 512 suffered a system-wide failure due to a maintenance protocol override." My voice was steadier than I felt. As I detailed the cascade of errors, electrical surges, hydraulic line failures, and the shutdown of the APU, Marcus's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. When I produced the cost-cutting memo stamped with Hayes's initials, the courtroom fell silent. The twist was mine. His own words had sealed his culpability. The judge leaned forward. "Ms. Johnson, is there anything more you wish to add?" I pressed my palm to the worn scrap of paper still folded in my pocket, my mother's reminder and my promise to speak truth to power. I exhaled and met the judge's gaze. "Yes," I said, "and I intend to ensure this never happens again. Nobody warned me that telling the truth would cost me my peace." Aisha Johnson's voice echoed in the empty hearing room as the gavel fell, signaling the end of the FAA proceedings, but not the end of her fight. She rose from the witness stand, green sweater still clinging to her shoulders like a badge of honor, the letters Kando faintly visible on her notepad peeking from her satchel. In that moment, she felt every eye on her, the regulators who'd nodded gravely at her testimony, the lawyers who'd tried to discredit her, and most importantly, the families of Flight 512 who had found courage in her calm commands. The weight of Marcus Hayes's cost-cutting memo had laid bare the lethal gamble his company took, and for a split second, Aisha pictured the flicker of sparks in the cockpit as that override switch sparked life back into the rudder control. That instant had been her crucible, a test of whether one voice could stand against an institution built on profit and power. Outside the courthouse, cameras and smartphones awaited like vultures. Reporters lobbed questions. "Will you pursue civil action? Do you feel vindicated?" But Aisha kept her answers brief. She thought of the little boy who drew her wings of light, the elderly man's whispered prayers in Spanish, the mother whose tears had mirrored her own. Their faith in her wasn't a token. It was a call to arms. As she stepped onto the courthouse steps, the desert wind whipped around her, lifting stray pages from her notepad into the afternoon sun. One fluttered free, the sketch of those final crossword letters, scrawled quickly when adrenaline had carried her forward. It danced in the breeze before falling to the pavement, a symbol of hope made fragile by truth. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. "Be proud, my daughter," followed by dozens of notifications from aviation safety advocates, offering partnerships from civil liberties groups, praising her bravery from students begging for guest lectures. She realized the real battleground lay outside sterile legal confines. Change wouldn't come solely from rulemaking or regulatory reforms. It would come from building a community that refused to stay silent when corners were cut and lives were risked. Aisha inhaled, tasting the grit of the courthouse steps and the promise of an uncertain horizon. She tapped open a new email titled Coalition for Flight Safety and began to draft an invitation for survivors, engineers, flight crews, even disgruntled insiders like Marcus's own technicians to join her in forming a watchdog network. As the sun dipped behind Washington's monuments, she paused at the Lincoln Memorial's reflecting pool, its surface as still as the moment before destiny shifted. Her reflection blurred, split between the quiet professor and the woman who had saved 147 lives. She pressed a hand to her heart, feeling the steady thrum of conviction. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something larger, a movement born from one engine failure. One whispered talisman, one refusal to go unheard. And as the lights of the Capitol glowed in the distance, Aisha whispered to herself, "Now we rebuild." You think this ends when the headlines fade. Aisha Johnson's voice echoed through the university auditorium as she held up her worn crossword puzzle book, its final entry, Kando smudged by ink and tears. The audience of engineering students, survivors of Flight 512, and members of the newly formed Coalition for Flight Safety sat in rapt silence. Behind her, a large screen displayed photos the charred fuselage nestled in the Arizona dust, the little boy's drawing of an angel-winged plane, and the faded scrap of paper her mother once wrote. In that moment, Aisha wasn't just a professor or a passenger who stepped in. She was a living testament to the idea that courage doesn't end with one heroic act. The coalition's first night had been electric regulators, whistleblowers, flight attendants, even a handful of Marcus Hayes's former technicians joined forces determined to overhaul safety protocols. Emails poured in accusing airlines of valuing profit over people. Lawmakers began drafting bills mandating transparent maintenance records. Aisha sat at her kitchen table late into the night, drafting open letters on behalf of survivors, her green sweater draped over the chair like armor. Each keystroke felt like a pulse, a declaration that the risk she took wasn't a one-off miracle, but the spark for systemic change. Yet the real battle lay within her. After the hearing, she'd expected relief. Instead, she felt the weight of 147 lives pressing down on her chest every morning. Sleep came in fits of nightmares, the cockpit door stuck, the hiss of oxygen masks, the fiery scrape of metal on gravel. She often woke, clutching the little boy's drawing, tracing the wings with her fingertips until the paper balled in her palm. That sketch had become more than a thank you. It was a reminder that hope can be fragile and must be handled with care. Campus life resumed. Lectures on fluid dynamics and system redundancies echoed through the halls, but students now watched her differently. They asked not just for equations, but for stories, how she decided in that infinitesimal second to stand, how she risked everything without permission. Their questions sliced through her calm. What if we don't feel ready? How do we trust ourselves? She answered each one with the same truth her mother had given her. You don't wait for permission. You become the permission. Outside academia, airlines bristled at proposed reforms, citing cost and unnecessary bureaucracy. Marcus Hayes's name surfaced in investigations, but he remained shielded by corporate lawyers. Aisha refused to be silent. She organized survivor testimonials streamed live to shareholders, forcing confrontations between bottom-line executives and the people who nearly lost everything. Social media buzzed with "Trust yourself" and "Coddard can't cut corners," a digital chorus demanding accountability. Months later, on the anniversary of Flight 512's emergency landing, Aisha returned to the Sacaton Field Strip, not as a savior, but as a witness. The little runway, now refurbished with new lights funded by a safety grant she helped pass, stretched across the desert like a promise fulfilled. She knelt by the tarmac and unfolded the boy's drawing, pinning it under a marker flag that read, "In memory of vigilance." The asphalt shimmered in the midday heat, each grain a testament to lives saved by refusal to stay silent. As she stood, the wind picked up, stirring the drawing and her hair. In her pocket, the Trust Yourself note fluttered. Ahead, beyond the horizon, passenger jets carved contrails across the sky, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded here. Aisha's heart tightened, not in fear, but in anticipation. The movement she started was only beginning to take flight. She looked skyward and whispered, "Who will be next to trust themselves?" The question hung in the desert air, unanswered, yet unstoppable.